Well, thanks everyone for coming today. My instructions were to introduce myself, introduce Tony, and do all that in 2 to 3 minutes. So we're gonna beat that. As for me, I'm a year-round resident of Oak Bluffs, by way of New York and a few places in between. And like a lot of vineyarders, I do more than one thing. So I'm a freelance writer. I've done a number of articles for Martha's Vineyard magazine. I'm a essayist on the local Cape and Islands public radio station. And with my right brain, I'm a real estate broker. So if I look the slightest bit familiar to any of you, I'm a Red Cross volunteer, so maybe you have checked into one of my shelters during a hurricane, or you're a fellow tag sale junkie. So, but in any case, my latest honor is to have been asked by my friend Tony Horwitz to engage in a conversation, as opposed to he didn't want to do just a straight up at the podium type of talk about his latest work. He wanted to do it as more of a dialogue. And so, Tony, thanks very much for that honor.
Yep.
Okay. And as for Tony, he did not want a long, formal resume type of introduction, but a few points must be made. I'll stick to his major achievements. Tony's a native of Washington, D.C., and throughout most of his career, he has been a news reporter, a foreign correspondent. He has worked in areas as diverse as Saudi Arabia, Australia, and Kansas. I'm sorry, not Kansas, Indiana.
Indiana.
It's one of those middle.
I've been to Kansas too, but I worked in a newspaper in Indiana. Yeah.
And possibly, you be the judge, but possibly his greatest achievement was to eventually make the move to become a year-round vineyarder. And he has put down roots as a country boy now in West Tisbury. And he is writing, and he's become an author of a number of books, primarily focused on, I would say, U.S. history. And he is very eloquent when it comes to making history accessible to people like me who really don't read a lot of history books. But his work is always engaging and always informative. And one of his other accomplishments was that he wooed the fair and becoming woman to be his bride, and she in her own right very charming, really cool, very inspiring, and their best works are 2 very handsome and charming sons, one of whom, as we speak, is on his way home from, what, a month or 6 weeks or so?
6 weeks in Ethiopia.
Ethiopia. So I know he's going to have stories to tell. And, and again, this ranks somewhere high up, but one of Tony's other achievements is he has figured out a workaround the infamous Five Corners intersection.
Shh. Don't share it.
He is not telling.
No.
I know it. He's not telling. We're not here to talk about the day, I'm sorry, but we are going to talk about Midnight Rising, John Brown, and the Raid That Sparked the Civil War, a book that was published in 2011. And Tony, I mentioned your inspiring other half, who had something to do with the inspiration for this book, right?
Yeah. I don't know if my wife, Geraldine Brooks, is here anywhere. I hope not. So I can make fun of her. Yeah, I'd love to say this book grew out of, some earnest desire to talk about the most important episode in American history. But the reality is it came about because of the nagging of my wife. Geraldine writes historical fiction, and while she was researching a novel, March, about the Civil War, she came upon this group called the Secret Six, who were John Brown's innermost core of supporters in the lead up to his raid on Harper's Ferry, funneling him money and guns. And she said to me, in essence, you're a Civil War bore. you need to write a book about these guys. They're not well known, great story. And I was doing other things, and she kept after me. And finally, just to kind of get her off my back, I sat down and did some research on the Secret Six. And Geraldine, as always, was right. It's an amazing story of these 6 very prominent New Englanders, wealthy men, transcendentalists, etc., who conspire with John Brown, this abolitionist firebrand, in this rather unlikely scheme to overthrow slavery. But the more I read about them, the more I realized they were really Geraldine's characters, not mine. Geraldine loves to write about tortured idealists who strive and generally fail to live up to their ideals, and that pretty much describes the Secret Six. These guys are not profiles in courage. When their role in John Brown's raid is revealed, most of them run to Canada, and one of them checks himself into an insane asylum to avoid prosecution, where incidentally he's treated with cannabis and morphine, and comes out some weeks later declaring that he remembers nothing at all about the entire year of 1859, which might well have been possible. Anyway, through reading about these guys, I was really drawn to John Brown, who's the sort of center of their universe. This man who is willing to not just live for his beliefs, but to die for them, and believes that America's founding ideals of liberty and equality can only be fulfilled through the destruction of slavery, and believes that it's his God-given mission to do the job. And I got drawn really through the Secret Six. They're in the book. I make good fun of them in the book. But John Brown became the center.
Okay, thanks. Now, I'm just going to give, for any of you who, if it's been as long as it has for me since high school, just going to give you a brief little, this doesn't even do Cliff's Notes justice, but just to recap. Okay, now, just prior to the Civil War, 1859, John Brown had staged a raid on the U.S. Armory in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The raid failed, essentially. Got off to a
You're giving
rousing
it away.
It's in the
Spoiler
books.
alert.
I'm spoiling it all the way.
All right.
But, the raid got off to a tumultuous start, and it ultimately failed. Brown was tried and eventually executed for his crimes, and he became a legend. That's basically it. Now, Tony, one of the things that was lost on me in, back in my day, slavery was covered in maybe, one high school session, and John Brown was maybe a paragraph. But what was lost on me was the fact that Harper's Ferry was just supposed to be stage 1 and a whole nationwide or Southwide campaign to eradicate slavery. I thought it was just a little localized event to, for a slave revolt in Virginia or in that general Harper's Ferry environment. I had no idea this was going to be the start of this sweeping campaign, which was quite ambitious.
Yeah.
And a little naive, correct?
Yeah. John Brown was he was a big thinker, dreamer. This is a guy who did everything on a big scale, beginning with family. He has 20 children by 2 wives. He's a businessman who's constantly thinking up these grand schemes about the wool market or this or that. And when it comes to slavery, he concocts a very grandiose scheme that through seizing this federal armory in Harper's Ferry, and you have to sort of roll back and see America in 1859. There are only 2 armories in the whole country, Springfield, Massachusetts, and Harper's Ferry. There are only 17,000 people in the U.S. Army, and most of them are west of the Mississippi fighting Indians. So it's a much smaller military presence, and he's seizing this armory 60 miles from the capital, has 100,000 guns, and his notion is that he will take these guns, free and arm slaves, and begin a rolling campaign of liberation across the South that will upend this entire institution. So in one sense, it's vaguely plausible, and it sort of hit America a little bit the way 9/11 hit us. This band of 20 guerrillas coming from their hideout to seize a symbol of American power, because there's a lot of symbolism here too, and we can talk about that later. And just total shock to the nation that this could happen. But he's not as good at executing his plans as he is at dreaming them up, and that's part of what the book is about how what happens when he actually tries to carry through on this plan.
And in the planning stages, which went on for months, years, I mean, this was just an incredible amount of time put into this. This wasn't just, waking up this morning, I'm going to stage a raid. But in the process, he talked to a lot of other people within the abolitionist movement, black and white, and sharing his plan. And the reaction was not quite so enthusiastic, correct?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that's really intriguing about Brown. This was a man, again, who had great vision, and he had what one Boston hostess, he was kind of a celebrity in radical circles. It was a little like the Black Panthers in the 60s being wined and dined in, Manhattan salons. Brown is, dining with Thoreau and Emerson, and Bronson Alcott, who's a well-known transcendentalist, calls him the manliest man I've ever met. There's an interesting kind of homoerotic side to this story. We won't go there. But this Boston hostess talks about his moral magnetism. So he has this incredible ability to kind of fire people up. But then when they step back and think about what he's actually proposing, and the best example of this is Frederick Douglass, who's one of the many prominent abolitionists who he sort of involves in his scheme. And he really becomes friends with Douglass. And you have to think the 1850s, this is really unusual. A black man and a white man staying at each other's homes, really friends. But at the last minute, Douglass just kind of says, no, you go, but, as a fugitive slave or, a man who had run away from slavery, my chances, if I go with you, are not so good. And that was the response of a lot of, particularly African Americans, who certainly applauded his cause, but were just not convinced that he could carry it out. So he gets a rather mixed response.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that one of the things that sets Brown apart from most other abolitionists or abolitionist leaders of the time is that most abolitionists were pacifists. Mm-hmm. And Brown, I mean, his technique was to be, it was, like the black radical, phrase of 100 years later, by any means necessary. So he was not opposed to violence.
Right.
And I mean, some gruesome type tactics. And tell us a little bit about his character. And Tony does a great job of introducing you to Brown's childhood, his rearing, what sort of formed his idealism, his sense of righteousness. But he also had this violent streak. So tell us a little more about that.
This is in my view, he's the most polarizing figure in American history, and partly for this reason. I hope today we can all applaud his mission and agree that he was on the right side of history in seeing much more clearly than most other Americans that slavery had to be overthrown by force, as it turned out, to move forward. But he did so by violent means, and that is troubling, sets a troubling precedent. And yes, most abolitionists, following the lead of William Lloyd Garrison, who was really the founder of organized abolitionism in America, were devout pacifists who believe you change things through moral uplift and education, and that violence, even in the cause of freedom, is really only recapitulating the sins of slave drivers. Brown derides this as what he calls milk and water abolitionism, weak and ineffectual. And to him, slavery is already a state of war and must be met in kind. And he does that first in Kansas and then in Harper's Ferry and a few other places along the way. To me, the great irony of the story is that he's this man of, he has contempt for the mere speakers and writers and the preachers who are talking about the evils of slavery. And his motto is, action, action, action. In the end, he fails in his actions in Harper's Ferry, and he triumphs through the power of his words. It's really his... if he had been killed at Harper's Ferry, which nearly happened, or they had had his trial in a Guantanamo style, and we never heard from him again, we wouldn't be talking about him today. It's really his eloquence in court and in captivity and in going to the gallows that transforms him into this great figure. So I think there's a wonderful... He actually began as a pacifist. I won't say he ends as one. It's really not his violent actions, but his words that change history.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that struck me as the raid on Harper's Ferry was being planned and being waged was the contribution of technology to the cause. I mean, these days we think, well, how could even the Crusades have been waged without Facebook and Twitter? So,
Scary thought.
But they had some new toys at that time in the 1850s.
Well, I'm glad you asked this, actually, because this was something my editor made me take about 30 pages out of my book on technology. We think we live in an era of sort of future shock, to use the old phrase, and we've lived through tremendous change. It's nothing like what Americans in the first half of the 19th century experienced. This is a guy who's born in 1800 on a sort of stony farm in Connecticut, moves by ox cart to Ohio. You can imagine what that was like and what the roads were like. This is an era when everything moves at basically horse speed and sail speed. The news comes from Europe on a boat that takes 6 weeks. And by middle age, he is riding around the country on trains, sending telegraphs, posing for photographs. He loved having his portrait taken. He's a very conservative man in some ways in his religious beliefs and his views of his family, etc. But he's very smart about the new technology and the new media. And when the raid itself happens, he essentially leaks to the press. He knows this will get out, and he's really doing this as much for symbolic and shock value. And he lets a train pass that he knows will stop and telegraph. And the next minute, reporters are swarming all over the scene. And this becomes really one of the first breaking news stories in American history. So this guy, who is otherwise not so good at many things, is very savvy about working the new technology. So I found that a fascinating part of his life story. Yeah.
And a little slice of humor related to that was when, who was it, the head of the railroad had telegraphed back to Washington, there's a raid of abolitionists going on? Or?
Right. Well, again, this was such a shock. So this conductor who Brown lets leave Harper's Ferry after witnessing this uprising in progress gets to the next railroad station and sends this, a little bit exaggerated, but alarmist, abolitionists with guns, blacks and whites, seize the Federal Armory. And his superior goes, what? What drug are you on? Why? What? He just wants to keep the trains running on time, and he thinks this is crazy. And this telegraphic traffic actually became one of the best sources for my book, because it's all business. There's no spin. It's like, can we send the next train? No, there's 100 guys there. As a journalist and then writing history, you're always looking for reliable sources. This, to me, was the ultimate. They were just reporting the information as they had it at the time, purely in the interest of keeping the trains running. And so it's a fascinating communication.
Yeah. You enrich the story with a lot of character development, not only John Brown, but also some subordinate characters who are quite interesting. And I like the way you describe the raid as, or this whole episode as a casting call for the Civil War in many respects.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one reason I want to write this book, there's been, quite a bit written about Brown, is the overall cast of characters is so astonishing. I mean, he's the protagonist, but One, he has these 25 very dedicated people, including his daughter and daughter-in-law, who are along with him, and 5 black men in this band, mostly young men who are these tremendous idealists, also very romantic in another way. They're almost all, young men, and they are risking their lives to free 4 million slaves and save the soul of the nation. And they're working that hard with the girls. So there's kind of the intrigue of what happens in a guerrilla band. Then you have the Secret Six that I talked about. But then on the other side, you have this just amazing, as you put, a casting call for the Confederacy. He will ultimately be opposed in Harper's Ferry by U.S. Marines under the command of Robert E. Lee, joined by Jeb Stuart. Stonewall Jackson appears on the scene, though he's not yet known as Stonewall. John Wilkes Booth is present at his execution, and in Congress, Jefferson Davis is leading the charge to sort of bring the perpetrators to justice. So you see all these soon-to-be very famous figures before they become not only famous but self-conscious. So there are letters, and you see them in a more, I think, a more revealing light at this moment, just on the eve of them. I don't know, it's like reading about Jimi Hendrix before he had his first concert or something. This was what he liked before he became a big man. So I found that really fascinating.
Tell us a little bit about Dangerfield Newby, who I found a very interesting character.
Yeah. To me, the most compelling characters in this book are actually in this story, are the raiders, the people who went with Brown, because most of them are much younger than he is, and they share his militant commitment to overthrowing slavery, but in most cases they're entirely unlike them. And none of them are religious. They're all very different from them. They're all their own people. And while they're in this hideout for a couple months preparing the raid, they're also very indiscreet. They're writing letters to all their girlfriends and all over the country, so we really can see them as people. And to me, one of the most interesting is this man, Dangerfield Newby, who's born into slavery in Virginia, but is freed in the 1850s when his owner moves to Ohio. But his wife and children are still in bondage in Virginia, and he is desperate to free them. And he saves an extraordinary amount of money for a former slave. He has CDs in Ohio banks, so he can buy his family's freedom. But their owner keeps raising the price and refusing to sell. And this leads to this really wrenching series of letters from his wife, who fears she's going to be sold to a gang labor plantation in the Deep South, which was a very common fate for Virginia slaves in this era. Hey, can I read a few lines?
Please.
From one of the, yeah, I mean, I hate reading, but just to give you a flavor of, these people, if I can find it. All right, this is one of her letters in the summer of 1859. Oh, dear Dangerfield, come this fall without fail, money or no money. If you do not get me, somebody else will, and then all my bright hopes for the future are blasted. If I thought I should never see you again, this earth would have no charms for me. Do all you can for me, which I have no doubt you will. Your affectionate wife, Harriet. Dangerfield is in Ohio at this point, heeds this plea, seeks out Brown's band, joins them, goes to their hideout, and then, in October, they raid Harper's Ferry, which sparks a bloody street battle, and the first person hit is Dangerfield Newby, shot dead in the street, 50 miles short of his goal of rescuing Harriet, who is then sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. It kind of brought home to me how much was at stake individually as well as collectively for all the people wrapped up in this raid. Each of them had their own reason for being there, and I find his story particularly poignant.
Yeah, it's amazing. This was just one of many letters that you came across, correct, in doing your research. And the research, if you just look at, like a quarter of the book seems to be, appendix, notes. I mean, just the exhaustive amount of records. So fortunately, on the one hand, you had the good fortune of being able to rely on being able to do a lot of secondary research, things that had already been researched, to death by. And I love the term brainiacs. Tell us about the
Browniacs.
I'm sorry, brainiacs. Browniacs.
Browniacs.
The browniacs.
Some of them are also brainiacs.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this sort of community of, I call them browniacs. I don't know what they call themselves. People who are obsessed with John Brown. And in this case, they love him. He's a sort of unblemished saint. Part of the reason I want to write this book is, again, this guy is so divisive. And most of what's been written about him has either cast him as a homicidal maniac or as this, hero martyr. And I just don't feel you can fit him or anyone else into that kind of easy pigeonhole. So they're definitely in the hero martyr camp. And they have various meetings and gatherings that I attended where, they praise John Brown. But they're also wonderful sources because they're mostly sort of amateur historians who have done really deep dish research on some corner of his life and career. So, that was a good source for me. They led me to some very good, obscure places I might not otherwise have found.
And their reactions to the book?
Not so good. It's interesting because my previous books, I've tended to be attacked by the right. I wrote a book, Confederates in the Attic, about memory of the Civil War in the South. And so a lot of neo-Confederates and white Southerners who are still waving their rebel flags hated my book because I feel I just presented it all honestly. I don't really put much spin in my books. I'm a journalist. It's kind of, here it is, you make your own judgments. This book, I got more of an attack from the left, I would say, because again, John Brown has gone through this amazing roller coaster since his death of we love him, we hate him, we love him. He's been embraced over the years by bomb-throwing anarchists in the late 19th century, civil rights activists in the early 20th century, Black Panthers. I think it was H. Rap Brown called him the blackest white man who ever lived. By weathermen, but then in recent decades by Timothy McVeigh and anti-abortion bombers who have stood up in court and cited him as a model. So he has this very complicated legacy. And at the moment, I would say in Browniac and academic circles, it's kind of, he's this great hero. And my book's, I hope, a little more nuanced than that. There's much that I admire about him, but there's much that's really troubling. He's really this Ahab figure whose white whale is the destruction of slavery, and he will take everyone down with him if necessary to achieve that, including his own family. A number of his family members die as a result of his actions. So I tried to just present him warts and all and leave it to the reader to decide. And I would say in the Browniac camp, yeah, I'm not super popular.
Not meant to be a puff piece.
Yeah.
Anybody think this sounds like a movie? Raise your hand. Well, you can be among the first to know that I understand it's been optioned by someone in Hollywood.
Yeah, allegedly, as of 3 days ago. Mind you, I haven't seen a contract or anything, but they announced it. This is the way Hollywood works. The writer always comes last. But allegedly, Paul Giamatti, John Adams, he's not playing John Brown, thank God. He is not the right physical type. But he has a production company, and they are allegedly turning it into a movie. I am trying out for the part of Harriet Tubman, who figures in the story at one point. But that's, on one hand, I'm delighted. On the other hand, as any writer will tell you, many of us has been through this tease before. So many things have to go right for a movie to eventually happen that I'm not holding my breath.
I'm sort of picturing, even though it's kind of close to Lincoln, I'm sort of picturing Daniel Day-Lewis. It's just because
Daniel Day-Lewis, well, he's a great actor. I'm thinking more like Chris Cooper. Do you know? Brown has this intensity. He has these eyes. Everyone talks about his eyes that would kind of lock with you, these gray-blue eyes. This man who, again, has this moral charisma, almost a prophet. And I think you need somebody who can convey that, and maybe a little bit of derangement. Tommy Lee Jones certainly looks the part, but my first choice would be Chris Cooper. Josh Brolin, I know, has been bandied about. He's another, intense and craggy. But, I'm not going to have any say in that.
Okay. Any final words before we take a few questions?
No, I'd love to hear from the audience, so don't be shy. Just fire away. I think there's a mic set up, so if you have a question, just step forward and any subject.
The book is terrific. Highly recommend it to anybody. I'd like to push you on the question of the use of history. Jill Lepore just spoke before you and said that her word was crap, that historians tell us how to understand our current era.
Right.
So my question is it not plausible that if you want to understand Al-Qaeda, that you should read about John Brown? That, in other words, that the question of is he a terrorist or is he not a terrorist and all of that, how can we understand Osama bin Laden, that putting him into the context of John Brown is very helpful for understanding the current situation.
Well, first on Jill's point, Jill is my favorite historian, so I don't disagree with her. I think what she's saying is this habit we have of sort of collapsing the past and present and talking about, for instance, when the Tea Party talks about the founders as if they really understand them or they would have understood us, is a fallacy. So I think that's kind of her point. But I do, and I talk about it a little in the book. I put the idea out there. There are some really striking parallels between 9/11 and what Brown did. Some of them I mentioned before, this kind of symbolic strike on the World Trade Center on one hand and the U.S. Armory in the other. The exact same number of men involved. He marches into Harper's Ferry with 19 guys. The guerrilla hideout. There are a lot of the secret backers. And the religious zeal. I mean, Brown is very much, his impulse is deeply religious. He feels he is delivering God's justice to slaveholders. So there are a lot of parallels, so I think it's instructive to think about, I hope when people read this, and I certainly couldn't help when writing it, thinking about that without being too simplistic. I mean, in narrow terms, Brown is a terrorist. He uses terror, psychological terror, as a weapon and violence. On the other hand, he's not a terrorist in the way we've come to think about it today, as somebody who's slaughtering thousands of innocents. Brown is a little more targeted than that, and doesn't let him off the hook, but the death toll is pretty small. The number who you would say were genuine sort of non-combatants is even smaller. So I think it's a mistake to simply brand him a terrorist and therefore expunge him. And this is why I find him so fascinating. There was a wonderful novelist named Truman Nelson, who I'd never heard of until I did this book, who wrote, about 50 years ago, wrote a couple books on John Brown. He has a wonderful line where he calls John Brown the pebble in the shoe of American history. He's kind of always there, this irritant that we can't quite shake out, because how do we feel about this guy, who's doing social justice, but in a way that makes us uncomfortable. And I think in the end, you need to embrace that discomfort with him. And yes, maybe think about terrorism in a more complex way than we tend to, or think about all these questions of, is violence ever justified in the pursuit of social justice? Does an individual ever have the right to defy the laws of his land? All these questions that I think are still very relevant, but there aren't easy answers. I think that's the mistake, where most books, I think, written on Brown try and like come down strongly on the one side or the other. There's something about him that drives people bonkers. And they even great historians, or Robert Penn Warren, one of my favorite writers, wrote the worst book you've ever read on John Brown because he was just deranged by this man. So I think we have to embrace the complexity. Yeah.
Just one anecdote that you might enjoy.
Yeah.
My wife and I taught a course last semester on great trials in history, and John Brown was one of them.
Yeah.
And at the end of it, when we were trying to figure out, what do the students think about this, I thought of asking them this way. I said to them, would you be happy to discover that John Brown was in your ancestry?
Right.
And one of the students looked at us and said, only people from your generation would ask that kind of question. We don't give a damn about what your ancestry is.
Right. Well, I'll just say briefly, if there are lawyers in the audience, it's a great legal drama, and again, quite relevant to today, because they could have executed him on the spot, sort of military tribunal justice, or had a secret trial. And the Virginians decide to have an open trial in court filled with the press, which turns out, from their perspective, to have been a big mistake. They should have just shut him away, and he uses the courtroom essentially as a press conference. And so it raises really interesting legal questions as well. Yeah.
When you do go into casting, you should check out Nick Nolte's mugshot.
Nick Nolte, absolutely.
So listen, Tony, I've been a huge fan of yours for years. This is very exciting, and as a born and bred Georgian, I loved Confederates in the Attic. So to that end, first of all, could you speak a little bit about Lee's role in the raid? And second of all, are there ever any reenactors of the Harper's Ferry raid?
To your second question first, I was tempted as I got into this project to do a Confederates in the Attic style thing where I weave between past and present, and I hang out with reenactors, because there's a lot of weird stuff that goes on around John Brown. On my first trip to Harper's Ferry, I was on my way to the archives, and this ranger says, there's a John Brown beard growing contest going on up the street. Not a big spectator event, but I thought, wow, I should go interview those guys. And then later I went to a reenactment of his hanging on the 150th anniversary, and they had the wagon, and he was bound because the courthouse where he was tried is still there. The landscape is remarkably intact, and the field where he was hanged, and they had the scaffold. It wasn't a super hardcore event. He did walk up the scaffold, but they stopped there. But in the end, I just decided the historical story was so good that I didn't want to kind of get in the way with it with my own antics in the present. It's such a tense, sweaty drama that I didn't want to break the spell of the 19th century. Now I've forgotten your first question.
You felt comfortable speaking a little about Lee's role.
Oh, Lee. Yeah, I felt after researching this, I was never, Lee the Marble Man. I wasn't necessarily one of those who extolled him, but after doing this book, I really think he gets a pass he doesn't deserve. His letters through this about slavery, about all of this. He is a man of his place in era. All this notion of Lee as the reluctant warrior for the South who hated slavery but felt loyalty to his state is crap. He's a major slave owner. There are allegations that he whipped his own slaves. That happens right in this period. He totally misses the boat. He doesn't see the significance of Brown's raid. He's also tone deaf politically. He just thinks this guy is a mosquito, and that he's Lee. I'll tell you what is impressive about Lee. He handles the situation very coolly. You see him as a very smart, cool military man, because initially there's this insane hysteria. There are 1,000 people with guns in Harper's Ferry. It's 20 guys. And he gets there and assesses the situation very coolly, brings it to an end. So you see his military genius, but as a social and political thinker, no. I think he's just no worse than men of his class in Europe, but very much a part of that. Yeah. Hey.
This may be the last,
As,
but
as an old classmate of Tony's,
Yes, hey.
I just want to kind of defend, I thought, the rigor of the book in dealing with showing all the different facts, because I think you very clearly show that the first Kansas raid was a response to pro-slavery terrorism, murder, violence at Lawrence, Kansas.
Right.
And that's very clear in the book. You also show that Brown perhaps knew that he was just going to initiate a dialogue and sacrifice himself for that purpose.
Right. Yeah.
And some of his followers perhaps also knew that.
Right.
And no one else was even going to begin the dialogue, including
Right.
Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
According to your book.
Yeah. Well,
Which I
think
thought
that's
was a
good
very
point.
so. I saw him as I think you show those facts, including the prominent intellectuals who held meetings after the insurrection, Melville,
Right.
Thoreau, and count. It seems like
Right.
many others that finally moved the North into the war.
Right.
So
yeah. That's his role.
I
He's
enjoy
a
that.
spark plug.
So as a result, I think perhaps you do yourself more justice, do the book more justice, to resist what's kind of a cultural desire to look at the extremist side of things. Because I didn't see any connection at all to Al-Qaeda.
Okay. Good.
And
That's a
if we look at the
response.
reality of Southern life,
Right.
and the life of slaves,
Right.
and the murder and terrorism
Yeah.
that was going on, it was really
It was a state of
quite
war.
a just war.
Anyway, since you're a friend, Cal Hoffman, a fellow
I'm
writer,
just trying to defend.
I think we're getting the cut signal, but
Yeah.
I'm going to be over signing tent, not going anywhere. So if you have other questions, you can come get me there.